Speakers series. We have a very distinguished panel with us today, and it is my pleasure to welcome General Nadeem AHMED, Hans Goodman, and ELIF AYHAN to this webinar discussion moderated by General ASGHARNAWAZ. Disasters, as you all well know, have become a very common occurrence in our lives, and we in Pakistan have experienced the whole range of hydrometeorological disasters, ranging from riverine to flash floods and from glacial lake outbursts floods to heat islands. Disasters bring with them disruption and dislocation. They affect people differently depending on location, economic resilience, and social capabilities and capacities. Generally speaking, however, women and the poor are more vulnerable because their coping capacities are poor. A disaster is not only about loss of life, livelihoods, and asset holdings. It is also about higher exposure to future risks and loss of opportunity for growth and development. There is another aspect to which little attention is paid, and that is about loss of dignity, emotional despair, mental health, and panic and anxiety about an uncertain future. How can we strengthen our adaptive resilience? How important is regional cooperation for mitigating risks? What kind of risk financing options are available to us? Who should be responsible for loss and damage? These are just some of the questions that our panelists will address to help improve our understanding on how to be better prepared and improve resilience for coping with fragility and crisis. To carry this conversation forward, I now request General ASGHARNAWAZ to moderate the session. On behalf of the Civil Society Coalition for Climate Change and the World Bank, I once again want to thank our panelists and the audience for joining us. Thank you. Over to you, General ASGHARNAWAZ.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, as per Pakistan Standard Time, and good morning, good afternoon, good night to all the distant panelists and audiences. It's my profound privilege to be part of this webinar today as a moderator, and I'm thankful to Aisha for inviting me to this discourse on a subject which is very important, very close to my heart, and I think this is a subject which defines the future of this world. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate change presents a real threat which is dynamic, which is unpredictable, and perhaps it's disastrous in its effects. Pakistan, ladies and gentlemen, with its diverse geographic outlay and positioning, is at a center stage, facing the worst effects of the hydrometeorological disaster and also the climatological hazards. While we have the onset of extreme events that we have experienced across the length and breadth of our country, our southern scene also experiences the slow onset event of drought since last 2 decades, which is worsening. So it therefore forms a befitting frame of reference for regulating our discussion today. I must highlight, ladies and gentlemen, that 2015 was an eventful year because in this we witnessed the global framework of Sendai, the SDGs, and the Paris Climate Agreement coming into place. This year demonstrated the strong resolve of nations to foster a new approach of risk management against the natural hazards to offset and minimize disaster, thus enabling the sustainable development. However, while these frameworks complement each other, we find that gap exists in what we want to do and what we have achieved. The main driver to achieve the global targets is definitely the finances and the lack of resources, especially with the developing and the least developed countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact, however, remains that the country have to make way through the dense cloud of such challenges by enhancing the cooperation in non-political and unbiased manner through very constructive engagement. The risk awareness in the context of climate change has assumed added importance, and in this, the innovative financing, which is much talked of, and it was also stipulated in the Paris Climate Agreement, is now fast emerging as a dictate of time. So with this all premise in mind, we are here today to listen, to question, discuss and conclude in a tangible manner a way forward and give a very solid and meaningful input to the policymakers and the students of climate change. So today, as Aisha said, we have a very eminent panelist over here, Lieutenant General retired Nadeem AHMED. He's an eminent, I think, personality with 4 decades of diverse experience in the military service, petroleum and development, and disaster risk management. I've known him. He had been a predecessor, head of the Organization of National Disaster Management Authority and Earthquake Relief and Rehabilitation Authority, that is ERA. He was here when Pakistan faced the super floods, the massive floods of its history. He was there to manage that. And he had the honor of being the first CEO of the National Disaster Risk Management Fund, one of the best practice that we found, adopted by Pakistan. And he has extensively traveled all along, and we had the honor to be visiting the UN General Assembly. My second panelist is Mr. Hans Goodman, an old friend. He's Executive Director of Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. He's based at Bangkok, and he brings with him 25 years of experience in areas of integrated water resource management and trans-boundary water management. He also has a very strong background in environmental management, and his key achievement had been the Intergovernmental Mekong River Commission Management Secretariat of its management as Chief Executive Officer. He's also a research analyst, and I think he has a very deep insight into the topics that we are going to have under discussion. And my third panelist, AYHAN. She's a senior disaster risk management specialist. Like me, she's also a civil engineer, but perhaps a better engineer with a master's degree in structural and earthquake engineering. She's been a member of the Prime Minister Crisis Management Center and contributed to establishing a new disaster risk management system in Turkey. And for last over 13 years, she has been with the World Bank in various capacities. As a senior disaster risk management specialist at the moment, her current work program is in SAR covers with urban resilience, policy reforms to enhance disaster and climate resilience in India, Pakistan, and a regional level. So she has a deep eye for the region that we're going to talk of and all the issues. I'd first like to start with ELIF, ladies first. And how we will proceed forward is that I'm going to pose a question first and set the stage, give the time to each panelist to speak for around 5 to 7 minutes each on the given question. And after that, we will regulate the discussion by inviting the question and the answers from all the audience that we have. And in between, I will also take the opportunity to maybe put in certain more questions for discussion. So, Elif, starting with you, how do you view the risk governance in generally in the developing countries in South Asia, with special focus on Pakistan? What are the opportunities and what are the challenges, and how do you see an effective way forward? Over to you.
Thank you very much, General Nawaz. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure and privilege to be part of this session and to be together with this distinguished panelists, General Nadeem and Mr. GUTTMAN. Thinking about the challenges and opportunities, especially regarding risk awareness. That sounds an easy question, but I think it's actually too deep. Obviously, Pakistan faces a great risk and is one of the countries which will be impacted a lot with the climate change that's going on. And it's very nice for us. We're happy to see that this topic has the highest level political and administrative attention in the government, starting from the top management and all the technical levels. However, climate change is not the only issue Pakistan is facing, right? As General Nawaz mentioned, I'm also coming from an engineering background. I doubt that I'm a better engineer than him, but nonetheless, I studied earthquakes and I have listened one of the, saddest, most moving stories from General Nadeem himself from Kashmir earthquake, right? So when I think about risk awareness in Pakistan, although as a professional I support and as the World Bank we support, of course, all the considerations about climate change, I cannot help wondering, you know, these types of disasters shouldn't be exclusive from each other, right? So when we think about risk awareness, when we think about risk reduction, the first thing that we should maybe accept and take as a basis is it is multi-hazard, multi-sector, multi-agency. Response can be managed by one strong agency, but when we talk about enhancing resilience and risk reduction, it definitely requires cooperation among agencies, cooperation among different levels of governments, cooperation with civil society, with the communities, and also thinking about a multi-hazard approach. During the course of this session, I plan to bring some actual examples from programs and projects we support in Europe and Central Asia and also in South Asia. One is from my home country, Turkey, Istanbul Seismic Risk Mitigation Project. General Nadeem kindly visited. Another one is from Southeast Europe, the cooperation between Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia. And another one is from state of Kerala, from India. That's a multidimensional resilience approach. So we need to follow different approaches, bring in maybe different examples. But then again, we shouldn't forget, Pakistan has, again, in my humble opinion, a lot of very, very good and strong systems in place. One is the National Disaster Management Authority system, right? All the agency and its positioning within the government system. However, the way we see it, there has to be similar mechanisms, similar capacities established at the state and provincial levels as well, with the technical capacity, with human resources capacity. Another very good opportunity that Pakistan, we believe, should use is, of course, the fund. That's a unique system. Establishing a fund dedicated for risk reduction is not something that we see all around the world. But if I may touch upon an example from my home country, the compulsory earthquake insurance pool. The pool was established soon after the 99 Marmara earthquake, which caused 18,000 lives in Turkey. And it has become over the years, within more than 2 decades, it has become a very, very strong insurance pool dedicated to earthquakes. However, the system of the pool, the system of insurance stays exactly the same as it was established 20 years ago. So there are a lot of areas for improvement, but it's not easy to make those adjustments. So when we establish very good, strong systems, we also need to think about adaptability of those systems for new conditions, to respond to today's challenges. So I hope the National Disaster Risk Management Fund in Pakistan grows in a more adaptable manner, and we see the fund actually supporting long-term risk reduction programs at various levels, at the national level, at the local level, and in response to different types of disasters. One last point about risk awareness to me goes to communities. In our communities, in our families, we believe that disasters come from Allah, come from God. So we should patiently accept, and there is really not much to do. We should change that paradigm shift. There are so many good examples. If we can show the people, the beneficiaries, the communities, there is nothing natural about disasters. Shaking of the earth, that's natural. Rain is natural, but climate change, that's not natural. Collapsing buildings, that's not natural. That's because of the wrong decisions that humans have made along the way, the settlement patterns that our cities face today. So there is nothing natural about disasters. The effect of disasters can be minimized, mitigated. There are ways to do so, but it requires a lot of outreach, training, and demonstrating actual good examples to convince the public to that end. Let me stop here. Thank you. GENERALNADEEM, you're muted, sir.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much, Edith. And for all those audience who are joining us, as I can see the numbers growing, I'll just have a quick recap of what ELIF talked of on the governance so that everyone is on board. She talked of strong systems to be in place, the policies, legislations, all these things, a strong coordination mechanism amongst all the stakeholders, a multi-hazard approach which is peculiar to each country, to the threat that it faces. And of course, talked of the risk transfer. She gave an example of Turkey and the establishment of funds, that is again an innovative fund or finance approach. The most important, risk awareness and advocacy, a soft intervention which does not require an investment. That is what we are here also for. Now, of course, the disaster risk management approach in all types of development so that the risks or the damages are minimized. So with that, now it takes me to GENERALNADEEM. And sir, with your experience of management of National Disaster Risk Management Fund, which is one of the best practices, and of course it's first such intervention which has happened in Pakistan. So how do you look at risk financing and the risk transfer, sir? Do you think that it is sustainable in the third world countries, in the developing countries? And what are the emerging concepts and the trends in the given domain? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Asghar, and a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know, National Disaster Risk Management Fund is probably the first of its kind which has been created in a country like Pakistan. And this is one of the many firsts that Pakistan has done over the past. I think once you look at it as an innovation. Probably this is one of the best policy innovation that a country like Pakistan, which is developing, can do. It's basically a financial intermediary which receives the fund from the government of Pakistan, donated by different development partners, and push it on to the implementing partners who go through an accreditation process, whether it is the UN agencies or NGOs or even the provincial or the federal government departments. Now, this pre-qualification of the implementing partners is essential from the point of view that we want to ensure that the projects that we fund are implemented in the right letter and spirit. And these projects are, of course, not only evaluated very thoroughly, but also monitored during the process. They are in different stages of completion. So one part that the fund takes care of is, of course, the risk reduction, and there are certain areas that we are funding, right? The second part, which is related to your question, is disaster risk financing strategy. Now, this has been a new concept, a relatively new concept in Pakistan. We did not have a disaster risk financing strategy. And as you would know that in most of the disasters, what happened was that most of the funds that were being utilized for development would be rechannelized or reprogrammed to be able to respond to a disaster. And therefore, you could never achieve your development goals. Now, what we said that we need to come up with a DRF strategy which is very localized and which will be acceptable. In Pakistan, we have some small models of like crop insurance and livestock insurance, but the penetration and the numbers are very small, so it doesn't really make a strategic impact. So what we said as a first step, we need to come up with a DRF strategy, identify what are the financial instruments that are available in the market that can be utilized. And we have looked at the catastrophe bonds, which are available in the market. We have looked at the risk insurance on the lines of Turkey. ELIF mentioned about the this insurance pool that they've created in Turkey. We are looking at the contingent risk financing, which are available through Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, called the CAD-DDO. And we are also looking at the concept of risk pooling, wherein every province pools in like ₹1 billion per year into a central fund, which can be managed by either Ministry of Finance or by the State Bank. And we freeze it for 5 years and let the State Bank or the Ministry of Finance invest it and let it grow. So after 5 years, you will have sufficient funds to be able to respond to a kind of a middle-sized disaster, instead of then taking the money out of your development funds and putting it to respond. Now, having said that, these are the financial instruments, and I see that there is a lot of traction amongst the policymakers in Pakistan, the Ministry of Commerce, be it Ministry of Finance, be it the SCCP, the State Bank of Pakistan, some of the donors. So I think we are on track. This policy has already been prepared and it is being reviewed by different stakeholders. Now, the second part, which is equally important, is to have a national catastrophe model. And in our case, we are looking to develop a national catastrophe model with the help of SUPARCO, which looks at 4 perils. And I think some of the speakers mentioned about that. We're looking at the earthquake, we are looking at the floods, we are looking at the cyclones, and we are looking at the droughts. So, and there are 4 kind of models that we are going to prepare. One, of course, is the hazard module. One is the vulnerability module. The third is the loss estimation module, and the exposure module. So this will allow us to identify at a strategic level as to what kind of risks exist in certain areas. And this loss estimation module is something absolutely new. So it will give you a very good sense that if a disaster strikes of this magnitude, or if the flood comes of this magnitude, which are the areas that will get underwater, what kind of populations are living there, how much of that population is living under the poverty line, So you can come in with a very targeted intervention to help them, right? So that's the second thing that we are looking into risk financing. How do we do that? Now, there are ways to sort of, especially when you talk of catastrophe bond and risk insurance, you will have to pay a premium. So we're looking at, with the help of National Insurance Corporation Limited, as to what are the ways that we can, give up the premium, because without premium, it will not come. But once it comes to the contingent risk financing, being an IDA country, there are no commitment charges. The only thing that you have to do is to get into an arrangement with the World Bank and the ADB, and let's say get an allocation of $500 million each. And if and it's trigger based. So if a certain trigger is passed, like an earthquake of 7.3, this money will automatically become available to the government of Pakistan. So we're looking at these things, and hopefully when it gets fully operationalized, there will be a lot of things that will get addressed. Now, having done that, the third thing that we are doing is we are developing 2 pilots for risk financing. And at the moment, we are playing with different ideas as to how can we really help the population at risk. And out of those 2 programs, we are going to pilot at least one, formulate 2 and pilot 1 program for risk financing and see how it goes. Now, if there is enough traction, then of course, it will then depend upon the advocacy and the implementing partners. How do we spread it all over Pakistan? Because the biggest problem with the previous programs were the penetration was too less. There are not many beneficiaries. The models were too different. So we want to come up with a uniform model which has acceptability of not only the communities, but the provincial governments as well as the federal government. And this is a bottoms-up approach that we are going to follow. And hopefully, I'm quite positive that once it sees the day, this probably will be the answer for all the developing countries which are confronted with the problems or disasters, which come very frequently.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And for those who have just joined us, while we're talking of the risk financing and the risk transfer, General Nadeem was speaking about it, and he mentioned about that the National Disaster Risk Management Fund, which had been established in Pakistan with the collaboration of Asian Development Bank. Perhaps it's a very good innovative financial instrument which has come. It has funding by all donors, so it provides one window for the donors to come in and, of course, manage it in a very, very transparent manner. It promotes the very concept of risk reduction by, providing enough funds for disaster risk financing. He talked of local risk transfer solutions. So in order to get it a sustainability and various models that he talked of, and he also talked of that in the context of, like he gave an example, that it has to be, again, you have to have a very predictive management of disaster through hazard modules and vulnerability, the multi-hazard vulnerability risk assessment modules to be in place. Thank you very much, sir. And now I go on to Mr. Hans Goodman. Hans, with your experience of Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and that I've also been witnessing that you've been working all along in South Asia, and talking of the regional cooperation, your personal experience also in bridging the trans-boundary issues, bridging those gaps of trans-boundary issues. How do you see the regional cooperation? What are your views about the existing state of regional cooperation in Southeast Asia? What are the challenges? And how do you feel that we can move forward?
Thank you. Please allow me. As we all know, 2020 has shaken the world. COVID-19 not only has made tens of millions of people ill and killed over 1 million people, COVID-19, perhaps in the longer term, more importantly, has upended the economy and welfare of hundreds of millions of people and plunged many into poverty. But despite COVID-19, other disasters continue to cause havoc and destruction. And against the backdrop of more vulnerability and less safety net, eroded economic backup, and a disproportionate impact on the poorer and marginalized people, where do we go? Well, COVID-19 is devastating. There's now increasing hope that vaccines and treatments may make 2021 a year where there is some comeback in social and economic terms, and also importantly, an opportunity to build back better. But as this particular seminar is discussing, climate change and economic hardship has heightened other problems which needs to be dealt with. So COVID-19 has clearly shown that international cooperation is needed, and support institutions which are promoting the international cooperation are also very well needed. WHO has been rightly criticized, and other UN agencies as well, for a number of shortfalls. But again, it is currently one of the best formats for global cooperation, if not the only one in some areas, on global issues. In addition, regional cooperation and regional organizations, like the ones that I head, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, or ADPC, are important in addressing the regional issues and support the global agenda at the regional and national level. However, we all recognize, and I think that was touched upon in the previous presentation, there's one thing to identify that something needs to be done, and another one to identify what can and should be done. Pakistan specifically, and South Asia in general, is facing enormous challenges, whether it's the issues of melting glaciers, glacial lake outburst floods, droughts, locust swarms, floods, wrecking damage due to poor early warning systems, or poor preparedness, or medium-sized earthquakes, which still causes a lot of damage due to poor construction of houses, and I can go on. And ELIF, you pointed out that disasters are not an act of God or a will of its own, but in fact, it's people who are put in the place of events, and that causes the disaster. And so there's not an opportunity to give up, but rather to decide on where we put most of our efforts. And the term that I like to refer to often is fit for purpose. There's little point in having a $100 million US solution if the available budget is only $200,000. Nor is it appropriate to have a requirement of 200 staff with specific training in GIS application at the master's level if only 10 are available. We need a workable solution. I think tapping into GENERALNADEEM's work on being able to provide the financial support, and ELIF, who's pointing out the real issue of being able to come up with practical solutions to be able to address the issues at hand. I think that's how challenges needs to be met. We have a term called wicked problems, where we have incomplete and contradictory knowledge, a very large number of people and opinions involved, and a large economic burden. And as a wrap-up to a wicked problem, it's interconnectedness, which still needs a solution. However, I think there are a number of issues, and I'll get back to the international aspect of it in a moment, but let me digress a little bit just to prove the point of something new and something old. Over 100 years ago, there was a finding of that the crowd knows better than the individual in general. The issue then, back in the early 1900s, was to guess the weight of an ox. Out of almost 800 guesses of a lot of people of different areas, they came to the solution that it weighed about 550 kilos. The actual weight of the ox was 552 kilos. Now, the individual ranges from 50 to 1 ton, but the average was right. And this has been proven to be right in many other contexts. And it provides in itself a basis for why crowdsourcing of information works very well if you do it right. And the new approaches of using mobile phones as the main source of data collection can be very useful. But we also have issues of fake news, influences, and other problems of easy communication. Early warning systems, again, often use mobile phones to get the message out to people in harm. But in the Pacific, we also use it for post-disaster damage assessment through pushing out a request for information through an SMS type of questionnaire. And it's then sent back sorted by the cell towers rather than the phone numbers to know where the person was when they reported it. I can go on and go on. But I think, again, referring back to General Nadeem, risk financing and solutions like that lead to great potential to be able to start looking at new ways of working on these issues. But perhaps the take-home message here is that there's much to learn from the application of ideas and solutions by others in addressing our most pressing needs. And that's where I think regional cooperation and various formal or informal structures for sharing information has a great opportunity. The old saying of let's not reinvent the wheel is very, very true, I think, in this area of cooperation. But it also goes to the latest of information. Cutting edge technology is important. We now have remote sensing capabilities at the resolution down to centimeters. The military has it for a while, but it's now available. It may be very expensive if you want very high resolution, but much of it is free. Space agencies need funding, but they also need to demonstrate that the data can be used for good purposes. And in context of disasters, saving lives and protect poverty is such a use that is very, very pertinent. There is much more to do in these areas to apply it, and I still see, in my experience, too many pilot test projects compared to scaling up and scaling out to help millions of people. Well, before ceding my space to others, again, policy regulations, leveling the playing field, promote cooperation, both national and internationally, and supporting innovations are critical elements of development. And many critical aspects of development comes by chance. For those of you who have been around long enough would know, like I know, that one of the main changes in disruptive technologies in Asia is actually the humble motorbike. It enabled billions of people to do things they could not do before, saving lives, doing business, reducing inequality. Mobile phones, much the same, has disrupted society in mostly, but not only, good ways. We need more of that. And we need more of joining forces to need to cooperate, to understand. And I think we need to directly move across borders to be able to do that. We need trust. And I think my organization stands behind these values and want to work with the changes that is going on. And I'd be happy to elaborate as we move on for some of the more specific issues for Pakistan as we go on in international cooperation and a better understanding of how we deal with these issues as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans. And again, just to summarize, I am actually witness to be part, and I was also part of the RCC, which is driven by Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. We hosted one of the conferences here in Pakistan. COVID-19, a very pertinent example. I think it is one example of the international cooperation, but of course it is also an example that it has given a new meaning to the risk assessment. You talked of the regional and national, the international level cooperation, the interconnectedness. It is very important. Sharing the experiences, sharing the knowledge, early warnings, use of cutting-edge technology, and of course, very strong policy formulation. And one could not agree less that you have to have the joining forces to move forward. Having heard to all the three panelists, now I will just open the house for the question and answer sessions. You can have your comments or you can post in your question and answers, and I'll keep, put it to the concerned panelist. Are you receiving something?
General Sir, Assalamu alaikum. This is Imran Khalid. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sir, I had a quick question to all of the panelists. We've talked about financing and we've talked about some of the initiatives that the governments have taken, as well as think tanks. I'd really like to hear what the participants think about the role of communities moving forward in this regard. Communities are the first entities that come into contact with a potential disaster. How has their role evolved over the past 10 years? And how do the panelists see that evolvement bring in these other stakeholders, such as the government, in making the response better, so as to help the communities prepare better and respond to these disasters, not in as we're doing right now, which is post facto, but in terms of being better adept at taking initiative. So hopefully that's.
Thank you very much. I would like, Hans, because you have the experience and insight into multiple countries doing this, resilient communities. This is what he's asking.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that question. I think in Pakistan, but also across a lot of other countries, there's been put a lot of effort in trying to enable communities to be more proactive and more engaged and being able to protect themselves in a better manner, or in many cases also reduce the risks. Now, one of the critical issues in many areas is to have a fully end-to-end early warning system. That does not just mean that you provide an early warning that a flood is oncoming or a drought is coming, but also means that people knows what to do. And I think that's a critical element when you get down to the community level. The other part that we are quite closely engaged in Pakistan and a number of other countries is to really emphasize that coordination is needed between communities, between the local government, and importantly, between the private sector and other actors who want to be engaged in a positive sense, to be able to support. But if they're not coordinated, if they're not guided, if they're not engaged in what to do, it's very difficult for them to be successfully involved. Now, finally, I think there is a setup in some countries have been successful, in others it's emerging, and that's an issue which perhaps pertains back to GENERALNADEEM's work in providing financial resources, because in many countries there's still a tendency to have very heavy top-down decisions about what risk reduction measures in terms of infrastructure investment, etc., is done. And by enabling a more guided but decentralized approach for letting communities take at least the lead in what needs to be addressed and ideally how it's being addressed, of course with technical advice of technical structures, that has been proving to be very successful in some of the countries that we are working with. And I think overall that is an area where a lot of improvement can be done in order to ensure that the communities get the protection, the improvement, and areas in not just administrative, but also infrastructure that they need. I leave it at that for others to.
Nawaz, can I just chip in? Can I just chip in?
Yes.
Okay. Let me share my experience about CBDRM. You know, after the earthquake of 2005 in the 9 districts which are affected, we did carry out a lot of community-based disaster risk management exercises. And there was a great acceptability amongst the communities to learn how can they save themselves, being the first responders, as the questioner said. But when we tried to expand it to the other parts of Pakistan, we realized that the other communities were reluctant to go through this exercise because they had not seen the negative impact of disasters. So I think there's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done. Most of the districts or the people who had gone through a trauma because of a disaster are more willing and ready to go through a CBDRM exercise. you will be happy to note that the National Disaster Risk Management Fund, one of the priority area is to fund the community-based disaster risk management exercises. And this is not only, small little exercise. We formed two kind of committees. One is called the Union Council Disaster Risk Management Committee, and the other is the Union Council Disaster Risk Response Committees. And not only that, we train them through one of the best implementing partners like AHMED or Pakistan Red Crescent Society, but also provide them a lot of stores, which can help them fighting disasters. It can include, megaphones, it can include torches, like picks and shovels, ropes, boats, that. And there are, I think, about 30, 40 pieces of equipment that we provide to each community. Our experience so far has been that in the communities where we have worked, which have experienced disasters, the response has been very good. But for others, I think we need to enhance the advocacy level to get it going. But this is one of the priority programs with National Disaster Risk Management Fund.
Thank you very much.
Nawaz, may I pick up from where General Nadeem has left?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. Indeed, General Nadeem's experience is a great lesson for us, and that's the same phenomena we observe in all around the world, especially in the region. When a community is hit by a disaster, there is certain level of awareness, but we have a window of opportunity, right? Because a couple of generations pass, and that experience, those memories, painful memories are gone. And usually the devastation is not seen or visible in the daily life, and daily life brings a lot of more pressing challenges like jobs, shelter, food. So our experience show that if we get the message to the kids, to the students, they carry the message, and that level of awareness, at least questioning and demanding these services from their governments to their families. It's relatively easier when it comes to emergency response post-disaster. It's of course more challenging in the pre-disaster phase, right? So how do we create demand in communities for risk reduction programs? That's a true challenge. And also communities have a role to play in disaster risk financing as well. When we think of disaster risk financing as different instruments for different layers of risks, be it the government budget, be it the funds, be it contingent credit lines or contingent financing instruments such as CAT DDOs or others, remittances and how to direct remittances into risk reduction, disaster risk management system also plays a role. In the region, more and more we see diaspora bonds or special bonds issued to the citizens of a country living abroad and making, on average, probably a better living than the citizens within the country at that given time. And more we see countries also bringing in remittances as a risk financing layer in the broader scheme of works. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
may I ask a question?
yes, please.
Assalamualaikum. I'm Afia Salam, and I'm an environmental journalist as well as a development practitioner. And my question was about, the slow onset disasters, which are basically climate induced. And is there a response mechanism for that? Because we are already seeing a manifestation of those disasters due to extended droughts as well as sea intrusion in the southern part of our country. And these are somehow not tagged as disasters because these are really slow onset and the communities are being displaced. There is climate migration happening, but it is not being tagged as such. And this is how they are left out of any scheme of response. So can that be factored in whatever, is being done in the context of disaster management?
I think, Edith, you would like to say something about this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. That's really a very critical issue. In the World Bank, in our assessment of not maybe the disasters per se, but the concept of resilience, we definitely include coastal resilience. We definitely think about the broader or longer term impacts of climate change. As you have mentioned, the migration, people will have to move to find jobs and make a living and to continue their daily lives. In our classification, that's part of the agenda. And in South Asia, in several countries, including Bangladesh, we study coastal resilience. And I think in Pakistan as well, our teams are mostly focusing on these days in establishing platforms to look into these issues. Thank you.
May I just chip in here, Asghar?
Yes, sir.
That's a very important question. Actually, you know, slow onslaught disasters are normally not taken as disasters, and that's a huge problem. The lady is absolutely right. But just for her information, that we recently have received $188 million worth of assistance from the World Bank on for climate change adaptation. Basically, it also looks at water management issues, especially in the areas which are struck by drought. So hopefully there will be some money available for drought mitigation activities, especially in Sindh and in Balochistan. We need to have the right kind of partners, develop right kind of technologies and practices through a system wherein we can, you know, optimize or get to know the knowledge that has been gained by other countries with regard to drought management. Now, with sea intrusion, again, there is a dedicated funding available, and it can, I think, fall under the protection of the marine areas. So there is funding available. Currently, the NDRMF is making a management plan in consultation with all the stakeholders in the provinces. So I would strongly recommend to the lady that if she could get in touch with the requisite department of, let's say, province of Sindh and Balochistan, and give their input so that this management plan, which is being prepared by NDRMF, includes these two areas in the manner that it is helpful to the communities, and both as far as the land degradation because of the sea intrusion, as well as the drought, both can be managed effectively. And there are ways that it can be managed. And the money is available. It's only probably a bit of technology. Who will actually do it? You know, the devil is in the details. Which will be the department which will be responsible for it? Who will submit the projects for drought mitigation? So if we can get these things sorted out and get it in the management plan, the money is available.
Thank you, General Saab. So, I mean, I would be happy to assist in any form that I can. And if you can guide me to who to get in touch with you, or if I can get in touch with you and you can just route my request to get in touch, I'd be happy to help.
Okay. Within the National Disaster Risk Management Fund is Mr. Fawad, who's looking after the Hydromet project. So you just get in touch with him and he will be able to take you from there onwards.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
May I have just one word?
Yes, please.
And to your last question there, ADPC, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, we'd be happy to assist both General Nadeem and yourself, Aisha, with various experiences globally, because as Nadeem points out, there's many solutions. They may need tweaking, but there's many solutions for various issues around the world that can be applied.
Thank you very much. And I'll send off an email to both of you, and then if you can guide me, I'll talk to whoever is important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Hi, this is Anam. I posted my question in the chat box, but perhaps it was missed. So I'll just repeat it. just wondering in terms of financing, in terms of Pakistan, the CPIRs that were the climate public expenditure and institutional reviews that were conducted in 2015 and 2017 suggest that just below 10% on average, if I just round up the figures, of domestic budgets as specified in our annual development plans by the provinces are spent on what can be termed as climate relevant expenditures. So I just want to know, just out of curiosity, how are these new climate financing or disaster risk financing instruments being reflected in these annual development plans or local budgets? And are there experiences from other countries in South Asia where local domestic budgets have been utilized and assessed to see how climate relevant they are? Thank you.
Okay, I'll partially answer your question myself, and then I'll refer it to General Nadeem also. All these development funds that we have in the public sector development funds, there is an inbuilt component of having this risk management inbuilt into that. And there is a checklist which is given in the Planning and Development Division, which these environmental impact assessment is carried out, and also like all those that they have to be compliant into, they're in a seismic zone, their designs have to be compliant to all the seismic codes or the building codes which are applicable there. So that is somewhat hidden into that, and if I could roughly say so, that maybe it is around 1 or 2% or maybe 3% of that. Now comes the second part, that if we have to, take it onto all the sectors, then perhaps what you are saying so is correct in the respect, because what I was talking was perhaps the hard projects, the construction projects where such like investment is paid. But you also have to look it to another angle, that like there is a National Flood Protection Plan which has been approved. It has a lot of components, and I think its investment is past $2 billion US, and it has to be completed in a phased manner. Then certain mega projects, the interventions coming into the context of building of dams, by default, they have a flood mitigation plan built into these. But upfront, dedicating the funds for adaptation to climate change, for the risk management, they may not be visible into sectors like we talked of drought, so food security and the other sectors that we have, that you see those sort of investments being done over there. Maybe it is not visible in that manner. Over to General Nadeem, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. I think very interesting question. You need to look at it from two different angles. One is when the funds are mainstreamed into developmental activities and you take care of all these elements, whether it is risk reduction, environmental safeguards, or climate change adaptation. So they are mainstream. Don't make it responsibility of one odd department like NDMA and PDMA. Let every department which is carrying out a developmental activity must make sure that they are taking adequate safeguards against all these things. Now, the second part or the second prong is the dedicated funding. You will be happy to know when we started the NDRMF, we just started with $200 million. And as of today, we have something like $585 million financing available to us. And this is all the development partners' money, which have developed confidence over the National Disaster Risk Management Fund because of its procedures and processes. Now, within that, there is a dedicated pot for disaster risk reduction funding, which is in addition to the PSDP. Now, in this, the only catch is that 30% of the funding will have to come from the provinces or the implementing partner. So that much load will come onto the PSDP or the annual development plan of the provinces. But once it comes to the climate change, then it is 100% funding which will be provided by the NDRMF according to the priorities laid down by the Ministry of Climate Change in consultation with the provincial governments. So to cut it short, it's the two-pronged approach. One is where you are mainstreaming these into all the developmental activities, and everyone is responsible, not a single department. And then there is a dedicated stream of money outside the PSDP, which you can utilize for disaster risk reduction, as well as climate change adaptation. And I would just like to add that during the COVID, it was NDRMF which provided the first tranche of $50 million, which ran the entire COVID program of the government of Pakistan. So, you know, the fund has so much of flexibility that it can adapt to the evolving situations like a pandemic. And if you go and talk to the NDMA guys, they will tell you exactly that if NDRMF was not there, we would not have been able to run such a successful COVID program. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you, sir. Do we have a question?
Hello, this is Janera, and I had a question for the panelists. So everyone has spoken about how important regional cooperation is to move forward with disaster risk reduction. So my question is that what options are available that will find traction at country level to kickstart this process?
Politically, the most loaded question. Nawaz, all yours.
I would like you to kindly answer this.
Okay, I think when it comes to Pakistan, we are, we have always been saying that we are at a, strategically very important location in the world, geostrategically. But when you look at the disasters, probably we are in a very kind of unenviable position, because on one side we have India and on the other side we have Afghanistan, and we don't enjoy really kind of relationship that we should have with neighbors. There is a forum which is called South Asia Disaster Management something located in India, but you hardly see any cooperation or conference or exchange of ideas going on between these countries. Now, my friend from ADPC is an expert on transboundary water issues. And you would notice that most of the flooding that happens because of the heavy rains in the catchment areas in the occupied Kashmir, as well as in the Kabul River. So you may have excessive rains in Afghanistan, you may have excessive rains in, the upper reaches of Himalayan region in occupied Kashmir, but Pakistan would come to know about it at a very later stage, and the gates are open and the entire Pakistan gets flooded. So I think there is a very, very strong requirement that political issues must be, separated from the humanitarian issues. And if somehow we can bridge this divide, that, humanitarian issues must be dealt accordingly and no political considerations must be, brought into play, then probably there is a stronger chances of coordination amongst the regional countries. I'm sure we have a lot of such countries which have exchanged information in time in areas where GUTTMAN is working. But unfortunately, in the context of Pakistan, this is not happening. And most of the time, our flooding that happens is because of our eastern river gates being open and areas of southern Punjab getting into flood. So if we can somehow work out an arrangement, and this is, as I said, a political question, there is this SARC disaster management kind of organization which exists, but it's not really effective. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, Hans, I would like you to kindly comment on it, because you are also heading the RCC, which is a platform, and it is actually aimed at promoting this regional coordination. So maybe you would like to answer this, and also answer it in the context of the Asian platform that we have for the disaster risk reduction.
Yeah, I think there's a number of issues. As General Nadeem pointed out, there is the Disaster Management Center, which is part of the SARC mechanism, which has run into political issues of being properly formulated. But in answer to the question, I think apart from formal agreements and relations, which often, when it comes to water, runs into the difficulties of water rights and very politically sensitive issues. As General Nadeem pointed out, there should be, and in many cases there are, experiences of where countries can share information for early warning, particularly to floods, which is a fast onset. And I think there's lessons to be learned, and they don't necessarily always have to be very formalized, but they need to be structured enough to provide the early warning, a mix between what the operations are, if you're opening dams, together with what can be done at a remote sensing, sophisticated information gathering for the moment. Now, in the case of Pakistan in itself, as pointed out in many other fora, etc., as you said, yes, there are a number of rivers that are upstream outside Pakistan and therefore needs information for early warning. And I think there is ample opportunity of pushing this issue of sharing information without any strings attached to water rights or obligations for various other aspects related to the water, which is needed. There are a scope that we should push for very hard. Now, ADPC is, as Nawaz was pointing out, supporting the Regional Consultative Committee on Disaster Management, which is a volunteer engagement by 26 countries, including Pakistan, India, Nepal, Afghanistan, and others in the region, to work on issues such as regional cooperation, sharing information, and potentially build towards early warning, sharing information in that sort of sense. So building on what Nadeem was saying, I think we should push hard, and we should continue without forcing other complicating political issues. Because in general, my finding is that when you talk about helping people, even if they're in another country, there is a lot of goodwill to be built on, as you were mentioning, these humanitarian approaches. But we need to clearly separate them some kind from the legal obligations about whose water it is, because then you often get bogged down in very difficult discussions on water rights. And having headed a water management organization like the Mekong River Commission, these become sensitive and very complicated. And as we are facing the issues in the Nile River with Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt for the moment, because of a big dam that is being built, you can see the sensitivities in these areas. But I think both formal, but in many cases also perhaps informal agreements about sharing information and promote cooperation can work very well. And we are very well poised for an opportunity to be able to support Pakistan and its neighbors to be able to support that.
Zanera, while they've all answered your questions, I would like to add one thing. Each country has got its political, economic, and security concern. And when you have the contiguous frontiers, you must understand that disaster does not see any frontiers. So there are a number of forums. What General Nadeem was pointing out was SARC Disaster Management Center. There are forums like what ADPC is pursuing, the RCC, which is unbiased, it is non-political, and it actually wants to bridge all these gaps. There has to be a will to cooperate. There has to be a will to interconnect. There has to be will to share and give early warnings. It can happen to any countries. The case study of like Mekong River is with Goodman. There are other examples where the problems of lower riparian, upper riparian states with very robust early warning mechanism. In Pakistan, the monsoon enters from the east. So there are umbrella organizations of World Meteorological Organization that you share the information. But if it is a direct sharing, especially in the case of extreme onset events, you can save humanity. You can save a lot of people if you have that information available in a real time at local level. So there has to be will, there has to be need for greater engagements, and I think so that is where the importance of the regional cooperation, where the importance of organizations like ADPC and other organizations comes forth. So, any other questions that we have?
Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, so I have the floor. So I'm Saqib Jaffrey. I'm a professor of economics at City University of London. And thank you very much for your presentations and for, it's been very informative. I actually would like to ask two questions which reflect my own academic and research interest in development and disaster, how it affects vulnerable communities. The first one is that, development economists, academic development experts, you might say, tend to have viewed out-migration as an adaptive strategy to other risks, like climate-induced or conflict-induced risks of displacement and loss of livelihood. However, what happened with the pandemic, with COVID, is that that particular source not only got throttled, it got reversed. And perhaps in Pakistan, it was less so, and maybe General Nadeem, you might be able to address this, but it was certainly the case in our other neighboring countries. So if you can comment on that, what pandemics show us is somewhat different to what we have always thought as one of the safety valves resulting from other risks. The other question I have is that we've heard some mention of communities and how they're affected. But within communities, there are more or less vulnerable members of the community. And in particular, there's the issue of gender violence. I know that in the UK, during COVID, there has been a significant increase in gender-related violence. So how is that situation in Pakistan? I mean, are there any steps being taken to address these kind of internal vulnerabilities within communities as a result, as part of disaster management and risk reduction? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll make a brief comment and then maybe Nadeem will talk of it, and I'll also like ELIF to answer the first part of your question. Risk, it's not important that if you have a risk, so maybe the migration is only an answer. There are seismic zones where you have a problem of space and still you live over there. But you adapt to that, you develop according to that because you are living in a risk zone. So maybe in the context of COVID, so while you are living with a risk, there are measures that you take to mitigate its effects. Over to you, sir.
Okay, I think a very good question first. Let me address the issue of this migrations. In my own experience, and as you know, I'm not I'm mostly a practitioner, and from a practitioner point of view, what we have seen that most of the migrations that take place in Pakistan are because of the economic reasons. Now, once these people migrate to the from rural areas to urban areas, they get into unplanned settlements and add to the vulnerability of that city or township where they have moved in. So that adds to the vulnerability and risk to a particular settlement. I have not seen the trend of a reversed migration during COVID in Pakistan, because I was very closely involved in the COVID response, and in Pakistan at least we have not seen any such thing. But I know for a fact that most of the people who were living in rural areas, the COVID impact was very minimal in those areas. And most of the people who would go on leave to their villages, when they would come back, and I would ask them how was COVID and what are you doing to protect yourself, they would say that there's no COVID in the rural area, so we are not pushed about it. So that was the answer that I would get. And I interviewed maybe more than 30-40 odd people who came back from leave from their homes. But of course, we used to sort of put them into a kind of a quarantine for 7 days before we could give them some work. Now, the second point regarding gender violence. There is gender discrimination per se in Pakistan, not related to COVID, but because of, the cultural factors that we have been seeing for over a period of time, it is there. But as far as NDRMF is concerned, we are quite clear that all the projects that we do or we are funding, they are kind of, we make sure that there are 3 or 4 things that are catered for, that we reduce the risk. The gender part is, or gender discrimination is not done there. The third is environmental safeguards. And fourth is the social protection part. So all these things are a must. The ESMS, the environmental social management system, ensures that no project is approved unless these 4 areas are adequately addressed. So gender violence or gender discrimination because of COVID, I have not seen any in Pakistan recently, but gender discrimination to an extent as part of our culture, it is there. And I think there are a lot of now women organizations who are working on this to make sure that this element is reduced.
Elif, I would like you to comment about the first part, that is about the risk and the risk of a hazard, converting into a disaster, forcing into a migration.
Thank you. Thank you, Generalnawaz. So that's an interesting, different perspective, right? So when we think about, when we think from a development economics perspective, as our dear participant said, migration could be an opportunity, an adaptive strategy to cope with some economic challenges. When we think about a long-term climate resilience perspective, as Ms. Aifa Salam mentioned in her question, we kind of consider this migration due to climate as a negative thing. Why? Because we predict that it will happen due to the fact that, due to the impacts of climate change, certain parts of countries or certain parts of the planet will not be habitable anymore. Right, so people will not be able to live there, will not be able to make a livelihood, raise their families. So when we say it's something negative, it's an additional challenge, we look from probably a longer or broader time horizon. So that shows me some interesting approaches. For the shorter term, it's a fact that the economic challenges affect everybody, including those who have migrated to make a better living and to have hopefully contribute back to their families left home. So I think in the future we will see, in the coming years we will see the impact of COVID and the impact of this situation on the remittances more. There is already evidence that the remittances are going down globally. So let me stop here, and if I may also add a couple of sentences on the second part of the question. As most of the international financing, World Bank financing also comes together with a set of environmental and social guidelines, frameworks. All of our member countries have accepted and adopted, including Pakistan, of course, which includes certain rules and procedures for citizen engagement, for gender issues, and especially a zero tolerance policy for gender violence or any violence of that sort. In South Asia, I must say I'm observing a quite interesting situation which I would like to share with the panel and participants. Of course, as General Nadeem said, our countries have, we have our cultural realities, right? Which also reflects certain discrimination each of our countries has to cope with. But also there are pockets of different practices. For example, in South Asia countries, I see women working in construction sector. I'm an engineer myself, but while I was doing my studies in Turkey, I never thought of working in a construction site. That wasn't the tradition, right? So I would probably be a designer or whatever if I didn't start a development career. But I see women and families working in construction sites, and in some projects, these are brought up as specific indicators, percentage of women labor at the site. So this wasn't something that I was expecting to see, and I was very positively surprised seeing this. So there is, of course, a lot of work to be done, but there are also really, really inspiring examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I go on to the panelists for the final round, I'd just like to add one thing here. We must understand, when we contextualize the risk, we must understand that if you have a loss of something, then it is irrevocable and it is irreparable. But if you have a damage, it can always be recovered and repaired. So you need to see the migration resulting out of risk of some hazard versus staying there and fighting it out and accepting the damage of certain degrees. We need to actually analyze in that. Regarding the gender part of it, Pakistan, having gone through two mega disasters, one in 2005 earthquake and then the 2010 super floods, have come a long way to address this thing. National Disaster Management Authority, there is a gender and child set, which is doing a very good work for the vulnerable communities and the women-based, disaster risk management. There has been a work which has been done on the gender-based violence. We've also gone through the experiences of the temporary displaced people within the country, and General Nadeem managed one in a conflict situation. And again, here our social safety nets, our all development programs are actually factored through a gender lens. So there is a realization about that, and it's a greater realization about that because women and children almost constitute closer to 50% of the population. Now,
Nawaz, before you go back to the panelists, there's one question, a person who's been waiting for a long time. Can you please repeat his question? Thank you.
We'll have one last question, and then I'll go back to the panelists. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ahmad Farouk. So I have a question that in one of the World Bank reports, it is mentioned that by 2040, the lives of 800 million people in South Asia will be affected. In Pakistan, 10 districts have been identified as heat islands. This means mass out-migration. Do we have resilient cities and infrastructure to absorb these people? And how important it is to factor urban resilience in disaster management? Thank you.
Nadeem, you would like to answer this, sir?
No, I think the point is absolutely valid that we need to look at urban resilience, and there are, Karachi has recently experienced in the last almost like 4 or 5 years heat waves, and there are many other cities in Sindh who are experiencing the same heat waves. Now, what is the government doing? Really, I'm not aware of the efforts that have been put in. Neither this, we have talked about the heat wave and we have had some discussions on it within the experts, but I am not aware of any plan that has been formulated. I think one answer that comes readily to the mind is the climate change adaptation. And as you know that we have this made a commitment in the nationally determined contributions that we will bring down the emissions and to 20%, I think, by about 2030 at a cost of something like $40 billion. And that means getting something like $4 billion. So I think this heat waves can only be reduced by meticulously following some of the adaptation measures through climate change. Now, who will take the lead? You know that we had the climate change policy approved in 2002. Then you remember we had the dedicated climate change ministry, which was formulated. Then we had the climate change framework in 2012. Then recently, this nationally determined contributions, we have made kind of a commitment. The custodian of all this is the Ministry of Climate Change, but the implementation will have to be done, at the lower level with the provincial governments and the city governments. Do we have a management plan? My information is that as of yet, we do not have a management plan to tackle this issue. But the issue will revolve around resolving this the climate change issues, and we have to go in for taking adaptive measures. Unless we do that, it will be at the cost, and it has multifarious impacts which will spiral down to the communities in different ways. Early maturing crops, heavy rains, which will result in urban flooding, saline water or seawater intrusions. It can have multiple effects, and it will have a very, very, drastically negative impact on some of the areas. And we need to do something about it. So a great question, but I do not have a ready answer. Maybe the civil society of Coalition of Climate Change can do something about it with the Ministry of Climate Change, but we need to have a very, very effective Ministry of Climate Change. And the second thing that I would strongly recommend, as of now, disaster risk reduction is basically the responsibility of NDMA. It's not doing it. It's mostly response-centric. Climate change adaptation and mitigation is the responsibility of climate change. It does not have the technical capacity. So we need to get the two of them together and come up with management plans with enough resource allocation so that we can move forward. Otherwise, it will be just talk in the air and nothing else.
All right, just a comment here. Your observation is very pertinent, but we also have to look at it at a different plane. There is a population explosion. You need to actually arrest this growth.
Absolutely.
There are, after 18th Amendment and devolution, all what we have to do about the cities is to be managed by the provincial governments. We have to strengthen also the local government system. If we want to have the very good urban resilience, what happened in Karachi was a municipal failure. We also need to control the rural to urban migration. There are thinkings in the major cities that you are now trying to develop outside the cities and reduce the congestion or the density of population which is existing there. So all these measures at the policy level, and of course it requires a very coherent approach at the provincial and a very good coordination between the provinces and the federal government. Aisha, you would like to say something, and we are almost got at the finish time.
I think Afia wants to respond to this.
Okay.
May I?
Yes.
Thank you. So it will just be a quick response because I know you're at the end of the time. One thing is for reverse migration, and we have to see it's not only economic, and if it is economic, then again, I would like to go back that there are some climate triggers that, increase the economic vulnerabilities due to which people move. And if those measures are taken, where those the factors are taken away, people do go back. So I work with an organization in Kohistan in Sindh where we have witnessed reverse migration when people of the village were provided water access as well as solar energy. So there are these small pilots which civil society organizations do, and I would love to share with them, and I will do that over email with everybody in the group if you want, or if just with General Nadeem if you want. The other is as a gender-based violence. This is an intersectional issue. There has been a spike in gender-based violence, especially in the context of COVID. I think that was Mr. Jaffrey's question. And reports are being published about it. If you see the spike in the number of pregnancies which UNFPA has recorded during COVID, that is also an element of gender-based violence because not all the pregnancies were wanted pregnancies. There's a mental health component that people are not really looking at right now. That is also being documented. So because COVID is not over, these are work in progress, these reports. Periodic updates are being done. So I would suggest that we, engage, because this is a civil society coalition, it's easy from this platform to be able to engage with the organizations who are collecting data and analyzing it. The third is the heat wave management plan. So when it happened, League Pakistan was a very robust organization with the Commissioner Karachi, and Commissioner is a representative of the Federation. A full heat wave management plan has been chalked out. It hasn't kicked in because we've not had that level of heat wave, but the warnings that have been issued, and it was in conjunction with the metrics developed by the Met organization. So we have that. Of course, it hasn't come in place, but it's there. So, I mean, yes, I totally agree that it's fragmented because of the way organizations or departments in our government function, and there needs to be a lot more collaborative work. The other is as mitigation and adaptive measure. Recently, General Saab, I think we will be approaching NDMRF, a coalition for urban forestry has been put in place with the blessings of the Ministry of Climate Change as well, specifically to increase the green cover of Karachi by 2025. We have given it a sort of a catchy slogan, 25% by 2025. It's not, I mean, I hope it's not utopian, but it is aspirational because we need to increase the green cover as one mitigative measure for the heat waves, because we can't now pull down the buildings that we have, which actually are the reason why Karachi. So there are things that are happening. I would love to share them with all of you whenever there is time and opportunity.
Thank you. Very quick word from you, ELIF.
Thank you, General Nawaz. Thank you to General Nadeem and Mr. GUTTMAN, and thank you organizers and all the participants. In closing, I would like to emphasize that we cooperate at times of disasters as communities. Governments are able to find money and all the means and all the capacities at times of disasters because it's a must, they have to save lives. But getting prepared for disasters, risk reduction, climate adaptation, especially thinking about bringing in slow onset climate-triggered disasters is a challenge. It requires a lot of advocacy. As the World Bank, we are keeping all of these in our agenda almost as requirements, but we have to work together with civil society and take the knowledge and information to the citizens so that they demand this part as well. So that's why we value this platform a lot, and thank you very much for the opportunity. We continue to be strong partners, and we are looking forward to continued engagement on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Nadeem, a very noted comment.
You want me to comment or something?
Just a last comment, sir.
Okay. I think when you talk of disaster risk reduction and climate change, I just want to make one or two points. As of now, I think there is no cross-sectoral integration. If it is there, it's only by default and not by design. I think we need to look at this aspect very thoroughly and make sure that we can come up with an integrated program. Second point that I wish to highlight is that rather being an isolated responsibility of a particular department or an organization, let it be mainstream, both things, climate change and disaster risk reduction in all our development activities. It's not, a responsibility of one organization. It is the responsibility of every organization which is involved in development. And lastly, I think integration of DRR and climate change, to my mind, is a developmental imperative. If we don't take that in mind, we are going to lose a lot of money that we spend on development, and that development doesn't, is not strong enough to stand the pressures of the disasters that we have been facing, and losing lives and the trauma that goes on for such a long time. So I think these are the 3 points that I wish to just highlight and put it on the table for the consideration of the policymakers.
Right, Hans.
Well, thank you. Sure. I mean, as I mentioned earlier in prompting from your question, disaster risk reduction and preparedness is a great starting point for not only international cooperation, but also importantly, intersectorial cooperation between ministries. And it's usually a win-win to be able to help people, even if the politics sometimes prevents other types of cooperations. And early warning in floods and droughts, sharing experiences of how to respond to issues and protect, such as the heat waves we just discussed, are great opportunities to do that. But it's also important to ensure that it's not just a series of unconnected ad hoc events, but there is a need for a framework or mechanism to coordinate it. And whether that's formal or informal depends on the circumstances. We did discuss the issue about the Disaster Management Center under SAC and the political hurdles there. I mentioned ADPCs in promoting the RCC, and there's many other experiences globally about how that can work. Another thing I'd like to mention is that we often look at building resilience as it's used as a catch-all to all issues of adaptation, risk reduction, mitigation, and sustainability. But I think, as has been touched upon here, it's important to understand that the inherent in these concepts are also issues of equality, equity, fairness, as well as inclusiveness, and leaving no one behind, and different rights, including human rights. And finally, I think it's important that we look clearly on sorting out the signal from the noise. And some of the issues that were raised here, whether migration is looking for an opportunity or a response for a negative pressure, is important. What matters is dealing with the issue as compared to all of the fuss that it causes. And there are opportunities in early warning with earthquakes and other seismic events. The opportunities doesn't lie so much in the early warning as in risk reduction. And that's where I'm coming back to what I mentioned earlier, what is fit for purpose, scale to the magnitude of the hazard, and to most efficiently mitigate the impacts. And I think it's also important to be careful to talk about efficiency rather than effectiveness, because effectiveness of being able to deal effectively can be very, very expensive. And we know that the competition for financial and technical resources is high, and it's well known by government staff and local communities in Pakistan and other countries in South Asia. So having said all of that, I think despite all of the difficulties, there are great opportunities to address all of these issues as a whole. And ADPC, which Pakistan is a founding member, we are wholly engaged to assist with this and look forward to follow up to this very interesting and informative seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To conclude, first of all, I would like to thank ELIF, you, GENERALNADEEM, and Hans for being there and giving a very incisive views about today's topic. And ladies and gentlemen, we had an exhaustive discourse. Sorry, we have already overshot the time, but I would like to conclude on the note that, as I said earlier, the threat is real. we will always have a resource insufficiency. So we need to gear up all the resources. We need to have an out-of-box approach, the innovative financing that we talk of. We need to make the communities resilient. We need to strengthen our governance system, especially the local government governance system, which at the grassroots level. We need to promote cooperation within the country. We need to have a cooperation at the regional level, and we need to have a lot of engagements. And above all, we need to utilize the cutting edge technology. And in the end, what we are doing today, the awareness and advocacy need to send that message across to be prepared at all times. And I'm sure that when we present a continuous trend, we can definitely offset, and if not offset, minimize the damage through this proactive approach. Thank you very much. So nice.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.